Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And this week, we speak with President Jefferson.
How about, the letters at the end of my new book, Repairing Jefferson's America, which I'm just begging you all to read and promote.
Pretty shamelessly this week, I have to say.
I'm sorry, you'll hear it in the Jefferson Watch. I have never done that before, as you know, but I believe this is, not because it's my book, but the concepts in this book. At the end of it, there are 13 letters, as you know, and you chose one.
I did. And before you go there, I'm going to read something from your introduction to your book. I invite people who want more from their country and more from their individual lives to read this book and work consciously to become Jeffersonians. Every time I think about Jefferson's life as an amateur architect, amateur scientist, man of letters, scholar, and political philosopher, a man who cultivated friendship and pursued the good life with impeccable manners and generosity of spirit, I want to be more like him. That's from the introduction to Repairing Jefferson's America.
Hear, hear. I do want to be more like Jefferson. I know that Jefferson carries some baggage on certain questions. I think that Jefferson has a lot to answer for on the questions of race and slavery and the dispossession of Native Americans. But as you know, I take the whole man theory. I think we still desperately need Jefferson. And my book carefully distinguishes between Jefferson, the human being, and the Jeffersonian, his vision of what a well-educated citizenry could do, especially governing itself, as this letter that we looked at today suggests, at the local level, David. I have a couple of announcements to make here. We're having a third session of the January retreat. So the first one this year is on Oppenheimer. The second one is on Thoreau and Whitman. And then we're doing this course, this online humanities course. And this one is on the sort of slightly more traditional humanities subjects. It's on Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. And this starts on September 26th, a Saturday. It's a 5-week course. We meet on Saturdays for 2 hours. It's great because it's about Homer. And I know some of you think, oh my goodness, that sounds intimidating. Believe me, I will walk you through it. And that starts on September 26th for 5 Saturday Zoom sessions. And there's all the material there. Then in January, the Locksaw Lodge series, as you know, David. So every year, 2 of them. And then because there was such popular demand, we're opening up a third session. And then on March 15th through 21st, that's our third John Steinbeck retreat at Monterey and also at Bakersfield. That's March 15th through 21st. And we're hoping to go to Cuba in late February. We went last year. It wasn't a life-changing event. We're still on schedule to do it. We may have to postpone that till the fall, David, because of the pandemic. But Cuba is coming back sometime in this next calendar year, either in February 2021 or in November 2021. But the things that are definitely on are the online Homer course starting September 26th, 5 sessions, Zoom. Another humanities course after that to be determined, but in November, before the holidays. And then the 3 retreats at Locksaw Lodge in January. These are like amazing times in the snow. It's 30 degrees. We go to hot springs. We drink hot chocolate and beautiful mulled wine. Have extraordinary meals, some of which we cook ourselves. It's just paradise on earth.
That is a lot of information to absorb. Go to jeffersonhour.com for dates and more information on all of these events. Meanwhile, this week's show is about this letter that Jefferson wrote to John Adams on October 28th, 1813. And you call it in your book, you say this is one of the most important letters Jefferson ever wrote.
Yeah, we live in a meritocracy, or we like to think we do. At the end of his book on, I think it's called The Lexus and the Olive Tree, Tom Friedman says that America is number one for lots of reasons, and one of them is that we are more of a meritocracy than any other country. He said that in Europe, when you get a new job, people say, what school did you go to? That almost never happens in the United States. It's more, what do you know? What can you do? What can you advance? What skills do you have? And he just loves that idea that there's a meritocracy that still has, it's not perfect by any means in America. No one would say that. But there's still a lot of it there. And Jefferson was saying to Adams, I get it. There will always be these prominent families. Although the Jefferson family didn't turn out to be one, by the way. But they're the Adams family. And there are the Cabots and the Lodges and the Randolphs and the Pendletons and so on. these families that seem to have power over generations. Jefferson said, yeah, it's seldom the case that works by merit. Maybe the first generation had that power by merit, but the third generation has that power because they just happen to be of that family. And that's a pseudo-aristocracy. That doesn't do a country any good. In fact, it's a really degrading and inefficient element for a country to give power to families. Jefferson was really making the best claim among the founding fathers for an America that was based on meritocracy. And I think that's so important. And then the part that you found even more interesting in the letter is that he has a formula for how to do that you create incubators at the local level to create those aristocrats. They don't just emerge. You have to grow them by public education at the local level.
We've talked about that before, his concept of wards, but reading it in today's climate, I found it very interesting because people are they're attracted to that. They want local control of their local government. It's a hard argument to dispute. Who's better at deciding what our children need from their schools than the parents and the people who live in the community? Who's better at making the case for what the police should and shouldn't do than the people that live in the community? And we think of that in modern terms, and it's like, okay, well, your city's 500,000 people. How are you going to do that? But Jefferson had it set up so there would actually be small wards, as he called them, that would come together. It's a long conversation, and I'm sure that you could enlighten me well. But just think, if that had passed in Virginia and that became sort of a model, where we would be today, how much different things would be, or am I drifting here too much?
Well, I think you certainly are on to Jefferson's view. As I quoted in the program that late letter where he says Virginia's falling behind New England, and it just breaks his heart because it's Virginia, the most important of the revolutionary states. Massachusetts and Virginia. Virginia was the home of George Washington. Virginia is from the state from which the Declaration of Independence came. Virginia was the place of Patrick Henry. Virginia was essential. And then he watched it in the course of his lifetime begin its long, long, long decline until it winds up as the capital of the Confederacy. And then it wasn't until deep into the 20th century, really in the coming of the 21st century, that Virginia fully recovered. And now UVA and William and Mary and other schools in Virginia are amongst the nation's best. And there's a great new spirit in Virginia that's happening in our lifetime. But as our friend Jason Mieres would say from the House of Delegates, this is recent. Virginia had to crawl itself out of the morass of race and the Civil War and the legacy of the Civil War and the lost cause and all of that. And it took an enormous amount of time. And Jefferson's view was if you had just really gone about emphatic public local education, Virginia would never have slipped behind. And implicit in that is, I think, a belief that if Virginia had been better educated, his grandsons and their grandsons would have done something about slavery before it wound up being a civil war that killed 700,000 Americans. And so, yes, you just feel a sense of tragic loss. But it's a warning to each of us, David, that, as now we think about what's going on, say, with COVID and everything else, we must return our focus to public education, that public education is the answer. It's not the only answer, but if you only got one, if someone said to you, choose the tool with which you're going to save the world, you're going to save the American experiment, I would go absolutely. The first tool is a new, effervescent, more focused public education with courses on civics and the Constitution and ethics and moral judgment, that we have starved our public educational system, and we've made it do so many things that it needs to do, but which are not ethics, civics, history, and the humanities, or even STEM subjects for that matter, that we've asked too much of our school systems, and we have forgotten that they are primarily designed to create citizens more than anything else. And so I'm 100% with Jefferson. I think this is one of the most meaningful letters that he ever wrote. And then I love at the end, as you know, that passage you asked Mr. Jefferson to read where he says, we probably disagree about this, but you know what? We're too old to really change our views, and it's great that we're trying to explain them to each other. And you know what? We can agree to disagree about some things because we love each other.
Well, sir, I thank you and Mr. Jefferson for an enlightening conversation again this week and discussing all of this in our Perilous contest. And with that, sir, may we go to the show?
Yes, let's go to the show.
And as always, thanks for listening.
Thank you, everyone.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I'm pleased to have a conversation this week with you, sir, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Good day.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, I was hoping this week that we could have a conversation specifically about one of your letters, a letter that you wrote to John Adams in October of 1813. It was in this letter that, well, sir, you sort of educated Mr. Adams on your feeling about government, what you aspired to, what you hoped for America.
Our friendship had been interrupted by political passion. The ancient friendship that had existed between us had broken down. Not only did he take it personally that I had displaced him from the presidency, he had expected at least to serve a second term, but he also felt that I had employed unscrupulous individuals to write negative things about his administration. And so he was pretty upset with me and pretty bitter that the American people did not grant him a second term. And he had some significant issues in his family life. His son Charles was dying of alcoholism and bankruptcy and a roistering life. So we never saw each other again after the first days in March of 1801. He went back to Quincy, Massachusetts. In fact, he didn't stay for my inauguration. And unfortunately, we never saw each other again. But in 1812, our mutual friend, Dr. Rush, Benjamin Rush, got us to begin a new correspondence, that he convinced us that it was really important that we try to renew the friendship if possible. And so John Adams started on the first day of January 1812, and by the time of this letter, in late October of 1813, we had found a rhythm. The friendship was not fully restored yet, but we were certainly on the road to a greater harmony, and we were beginning to write about some pretty serious subjects, and one of them that inevitably came up was aristocracy. Adams had been known for decades to be in favor of aristocracy. He believed that aristocracy is inevitable, that there are families that are important in a hereditary fashion, and so he had been vilified for this because, of course, the emerging spirit of our country was a democratic spirit, an anti-aristocratical spirit, and so he believed that he had been falsely vilified and criticized for both his seeming commitment to monarchy and his embrace of aristocracy. So it was inevitable that at some point this subject would come up. And in the letter that you're pointing to, which I wrote on the 28th day of October, 1813, I responded to his notion that aristocracy is inevitable and we must simply find a way to manage it with an alternative view of what I think you would call meritocracy.
Sir, it reveals quite clearly what your vision for America's future governance could have been. And it would seem that what you wanted for our nation was very limited government, one administered by representatives who were of modest means and were reluctant to serve.
Well, not necessarily of modest means, but not ruling that out. In other words, there's always a place for someone like George Washington, who was one of the wealthiest men in America, or Robert Morris, the financier, or Aaron Burr, who married or courted a series of wealthy widows and dispossessed them of their estates. There's always going to be room for wealthy people, for privileged people, and for powerful people in our system. My concern is that we don't just yield everything to them, that they can't be the nation and they can't be the only leaders of the nation. So they can compete in fair elections alongside mechanics and sailors and army officers, or for that matter, mere privates in the army, or farmers or day laborers. And so the spirit of our system is that everyone is entitled to stand for public office. In some states, there was a property requirement, but assuming that that could be met, or in states like Virginia, abolish that altogether, then I want a system in which it's not just Mr. Hamilton's wise, rich, and well-born who can manage the country, but people from every possible walk of life.
Yes, if I'm reading correctly, sir, you were looking for citizens who were vigilant, who were educated, self-sufficient, and you also wanted all to be treated equally by what you referred to as, quote, the machine of the law.
That's correct. So it's hard for people of your era to understand this, but it was still widely felt that the great mass of people should mind their own business and keep away from the public square, that they should defer to wealthier people, people of higher social standing, people of rank or birth. This had been the case in Europe for thousands of years, and these habits die hard. And the way this was actually understood was by the word subordination. And John Adams believed in subordination, and essentially all conservatives did. Dr. Johnson of England, the great dictionary creator, was one of the greatest champions of subordination. And by it, he meant that mechanics and laborers and simple farmers and so on should automatically defer to their social betters, that it's in their interest to know their place and not to try to rise above it, and not to meddle in things that were really beyond their understanding or beyond their legitimate role in a community, that the world existed to have a handful of aristocrats at the top, and then a second tier of people who were privileged and maybe captains of industry or entrepreneurs. And then there was a middle class, and the middle class consisted of the great bulk of the people of the country, and then some lower classes or poor people, and beyond that, of course, slaves. And that all of these lower orders were designed by Providence, by God Himself, to be deferential, to remain subordinate to these more privileged people, and that this was the way the universe was expected to operate, by principles of deference and mutual confidence, that the aristocrats would watch out for the lower orders, but the lower orders would accept cheerfully that the public affairs were not really their business, and that it would be a mistake for them to arrogate to themselves opportunities and powers that they really had no way of responsibly handling. So that notion is very, very deeply woven into European culture. We broke with that when we created the United States. We were intending to do something quite different, but what we learned after the Revolution was successful, after the War of Independence was successful, that the Federalists, people like John Adams, had talked this way about the rights of man and equality of circumstance and the machine of the law and so on, but they didn't really mean it.
I am struck by that as well, Mr. Jefferson, looking at it from my time, a citizen of 2020, how unique it was during your time. In fact, in your letter you write, quote, "With respect to aristocracy, we should further consider that before the establishment of the American states, nothing was known to history but the man of the old world, crowded within limits, either small or overcharged, and steeped in the vices which that situation generates." In other words, this was a completely new way of governance.
I believe that average human beings are entitled to govern themselves, and beyond that they are capable of governing themselves. And if we despair of that the answer is to educate them, to educate them liberally so that they can rise to the challenge of self-government. But the idea that we should ever look down on them or dismiss them, I find that deeply offensive for two reasons. First of all, it's not true. It condemns the great mass of humanity to permanent subordinate status. It's just simply not true. And secondly, it's such hypocrisy, given the rhetoric of the founding generation in America. So I can be regarded in some quarters as sort of a traitor to my own class, the gentry, the squireocracy, say, of Virginia. I was a gentleman farmer and a surveyor and a public figure. But I was never going to believe that somebody who earned his living as a carpenter, as a cooper, as a barrel maker, as a common sailor, should be eliminated from our public councils. They have two things that Providence has given everyone. The first thing is a moral sense, that the Creator put into every human being a moral sense. The Creator gave us this compass so that when you're about to do something and it's wrong, and the moral sense is there. It's not something we have to teach in colleges. It's inherent in the human condition. So that's one tool that everybody has, and that could be the most brilliant person who ever lived, Leonardo da Vinci, say, or Socrates. But it also could be just a common plowman in a field. They share this equalizing function of the moral sense. And the second tool that we were given by birth is common sense. So a farmer may not understand Newtonian mechanics, and a farmer may not understand the transit of Venus, and a farmer may not understand the intricacies of tariffs and tax policy, and that farmer may not understand the similes of Homer or the poetic tropes of John Milton's Paradise Lost. He might. I wouldn't rule that out, but he might not. But he has something more important than all of that. He has common sense. And that common sense allows him to discriminate between good ideas and bad ideas, and it allows him to smell out demagoguery and hypocrisy and political posturing. So those tools, common sense, which everybody has, and that can be strengthened too by exercise, and the moral sense, which everybody has, those are extraordinarily important tools that the Creator, or God if you like, has implanted into the bosom of almost every human being. And they are, in the end, more important than your knowledge of Greek paradigms or the importance of Sanskrit.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We need to take a short break from this conversation, but we'll return to it in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we're discussing a letter that President Jefferson wrote to John Adams in October of 1813. And welcome back, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you, citizen.
I wanted to touch on your view of aristocracy once more before we get on to the second part of the letter, which I find fascinating. But in the letter, you talk about artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth, and then also natural aristocracy, which you say you consider as the most precious gift of nature. Now, you and Mr. Adams disagreed, and it's quite apparent which side each of you fell in this argument.
Yes. So Adams believes that there is an aristocracy, that no matter how you do things, if there were 250 people on an island and everyone was an equal founder of that island, that in a short time there would be an aristocracy that would emerge. Some would be richer and some would be poorer. We may be born equal with respect to our fundamental rights, but we're not born with equal talents, that there are poets and some who could never write a line of verse, and there are people who could build a ship and others that could never pound a nail, and there are people that know how to manage a farm and others that just don't have that skill but could be managed by a farm supervisor of some sort. And so Adams' view was, look, it's just this way, that there will emerge an aristocracy, no matter how you shuffle the cards or shake things out. There's no way around it, and we may as well just come to terms with it. And he said, furthermore, it will become hereditary. that the tallest man will become king, and then his son will become king, even if his son is a short man. But because the families, once they have power, will count on the deference of the people around them, and they will do things to protect their power and to shore it up and to create propaganda that means even a relatively weak son of that tall man would still be regarded by his fellows as a legitimate king. So you see the point that aristocracy just emerges whether you like it or not. And I see that, of course. You can't fail to see that in the history of humanity. But it doesn't have much to do with merit, certainly not after that first generation. And so I turn the concept of aristocracy on its head in this letter. It's one of the most important letters that I ever wrote, and I'll pick it up where I think the most important passage of the letter is. I say, I agree with you that there is a natural aristocracy among men, but now I shift away from Adams. The grounds of this are virtue and talents. Formerly, in the old times, bodily powers gave place among the aristoi. But since the invention of gunpowder has armed the weak as well as the strong with missile death, bodily strength like beauty, good humor, politeness, and other accomplishments has become but an auxiliary ground of distinction. There is also an artificial aristocracy founded merely on wealth and birth without either virtue or talents, for with these it could belong to the first class, in other words, if it had virtue and talents. I consider the natural aristocracy as the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trusts, and the government of society, and indeed it would have been inconsistent in creation to have formed man for the social state and not have provided virtue and wisdom enough to manage the concerns of the society. Now, this key sentence, may we not even say that that form of government is the best, which provides the most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristoi into the offices of government. But the artificial aristocracy, based on wealth and birth, is a mischievous ingredient in government, and provision should be made to prevent its ascendancy. You see the point, that we need what I'm calling a natural aristocracy, and that it's in the interests of a society to promote those people into positions of leadership, to watch them and supervise them to make sure they don't go wrong, but to put them in positions of leadership based on their talents, their intelligence, their wisdom, their virtue, their honesty, their integrity, their work ethic, their commitment to Commonwealth values. That's what we need to promote.
It's almost as if with this, what you called pseudo-aristocracy, there's little chance for the common citizen to prevail. In your letter, you talk about specific things, sir, that you did. You write, at the first session of our legislature after the Declaration of Independence, we passed a law abolishing entails, and this was followed by one abolishing the privilege of primogeniture and dividing the lands of estates equally among their children or other representatives. These laws, drawn by myself, laid the axe to the root of pseudo-aristocracy.
Yes. So how do people maintain their power? Again, if you go to a simple scenario, sort of the allegory of the island, and there's an island of 1,000 square miles, and you have 1,000 settlers, then presumably each one gets 1 square mile. You don't give one person 400 square miles and then crowd the rest onto the remaining 600. Then under an initial shuffling of the deck, every one of these settlers would get the same amount of initial land. Now, Adams would say that it won't take long before somebody owns 30 square miles or 300 square miles or 920 square miles, and the rest start to starve on the remainder of that land. This apparently is almost inevitable because some people work harder, some people are luckier, some people cheat, some people use intimidation. But for whatever reason, things don't remain equal very long. And I agree with Adams that that's unfortunately true. And so in Britain, for example, you have these families that own tens of thousands of acres, gigantic estates, and they pass them down from father to eldest son, and that father to eldest son, and so on. Well, you have to break these estates up somehow. It's unfair to the lesser sons and daughters, for one thing. If the eldest son gets everything and the rest almost nothing, that can hardly be fair under natural law. And secondly, this has the effect of keeping land in a single family in perpetuity, and that estate usually just grows and grows and grows and swallows up everything around it. And so the first thing I did after the Declaration was, as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, was to encourage the abolition of primogeniture and entail. So just let me very quickly explain. Primogeniture is that law which passes on the estate from the father to the eldest son. That seems to me to be an appalling failure of family justice. The estate should go to all of the children, or all of the competent children, or it should be certainly more widely distributed than simply till the eldest male child. So that's primogeniture. And entail is even worse. It's hard to explain, but in entail, I could say that if my daughter Martha, for example, married the wrong sort of person, or a person I didn't approve of, or just because I didn't want anyone else ever to own my land, I could say that her estate could only be passed on to people that were direct male descendants from my side of the family, that we would keep the land in the hands of actual Jeffersons. And if she married a Randolph or a Burrell or a Parkinson or anybody else, a Pendleton, that land could never go to those heirs, that it would have to stay within a certain family. This is a way of protecting a family's property and its sort of signature, its brand on that property across generations. And as you know from my other work, I believe that the earth belongs to the living, not the dead. The dead should have no capacity to determine how land is passed down 3 generations hence or 7 generations hence. And so entail, you can read about entail, say, in the novels of Jane Austen, and primogeniture too. These are feudal land tenure systems designed to protect property in the hands of a tiny landed aristocracy and to prevent the dispersal of these huge estates under any circumstances. And so I proposed that the House of Delegates abolish them. And by the way, there was a widespread agreement that it was time for those feudal land tenure laws to go. I'm not claiming any particular greatness of leadership in this, but I was the one that brought these reforms to the House of Delegates, and they passed, and that helps to solve a problem. That doesn't completely solve the problem of hereditary aristocracy, but as I said, it lays the axe. It begins to cut out the root of one part of that issue.
I want to get to another part of your letter, Mr. Jefferson. It's generally accepted that your idea was for the nation to be governed by smaller districts, individuals that were not part of the aristocracy, and it sounds like a great idea, although I can see Mr. Adams rolling his eyes and saying, "Mr. Jefferson, have you looked around?" But in fact, sir, I give you credit. In this letter, you lay out how that would work. In fact, you say that it was a bill presented to the legislature that did not pass, and it was based in educating the public.
The only way our republic can work is if you have a well-educated citizenry.
But you wanted, sir, to educate what forgive me, I would call the common people. You wanted to divide every county into what you called wards and provide for free education within these wards. I thought that was pretty astonishing for your time, sir.
The aristocrats tend to be well-educated because they have the means, and they want to perpetuate their rule. So what we need to do, if we really want the common people to govern themselves, I do say again, they have inherently a moral sense and inherently common sense, but we all know it takes more than that to be a good leader. So we need to educate them. We need to give them the same education that someone like John Adams would get at Harvard, or someone that like Colonel Hamilton would get at Columbia. So how do you do that? Well, they're not going to be able to afford it themselves in most cases. They're too busy just eking out a living on their farm in Virginia or Pennsylvania or New York. So we need to provide public schools that will educate them so that they will have the same set of governing tools that these privileged people, these aristocrats, have. And so I designed a system for Virginia. It was one of the bills that I added to my plan for remaking the law code of Virginia, and it was for the more general diffusion of knowledge. And as you say, it would divide and subdivide the state into more manageable units. So you wouldn't have a single statewide educational system in Virginia. You would first divide it into counties, and then you would divide the counties into townships, and then you would divide the townships into what I like to call hundreds or ward republics, so that every 100 farmer citizens would form their own little local democratic republic, and they would handle education within that jurisdiction. And this would be pure democracy. So there would be actual New England-style town meetings and actual democracy for white males in this ward republic. And then there would be the township government and the county government and the state government, and finally up to the national government. And the schools would be emphatically the work of these ward republics. And if you do this, if you spread literacy around and good sense and critical thinking skills and numeracy and some understanding of French and Latin and a reading of history and an examination of the fall of the Roman Republic and the roots of our own system in the Enlightenment. If you take an average farmer's child or a sailor or a cooper or a barrel maker and give that child the same education that Colonel Hamilton had thanks to his privilege, now you're creating an equality of skills so that people from the lower walks of life in a socioeconomic term will have the capacity, the skill set to serve as equally adroit leaders as people like John Adams or myself.
You write in the letter, my proposition had for a further object to impart to these wards those portions of self-government for which they are best qualified, by confiding to them the care of their poor, their roads, police, elections, the nomination of jurors, administration of justice in small cases, elementary exercises of militia, in short, to have made them little republics, with a warden at the head of each, for all those concerns which, being under their eye, they would better manage than the larger republics of the county or state. Sir, I must tell you that I think during my time those words would resonate with citizens. Local control is best.
Well, I wonder, I can't speak for your time. They didn't particularly resonate in my time. This was regarded as utopianism. Most people just brush this off as Mr. Jefferson being lost in the clouds again. But I do believe it. I believe that most human concerns are relatively simple ones. How do we educate our children? How do we police our property? How do we survey the land? Where should we put up the school? Should the bridge be over this portion of the Ravenna River or over that portion? How should we try local people accused of crimes? But those things are really profoundly local in nature, and they can be handled locally. In fact, they are best handled locally, so that under my system, most things can be handled at the local level. A few things really need to be handled at the state level, and a very few things, chiefly foreign policy, need to be handled at the national level. And the mistake that the Hamiltonians make, and to a degree this is also George Washington and John Adams, is they want a top-down system where these things are adjudicated at the national level and they somehow percolate down from Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, wherever the capital happens to be, to New Jersey and to Georgia and to the Carolinas. I would rather have North Carolina handle its own affairs to the maximum possible extent without any reference to any other system anywhere, except by the exchange of best practices and so on, and that it would only defer to something beyond North Carolina if there was some fundamental reason to do so. In other words, why would you turn to the national government for education? You might turn to the national government for the post office. You might turn to the national government for a common defense. You certainly would turn to the national government for our foreign policy with relation to France or England, but you wouldn't turn to the national government to build your county roads or to build an educational system for your for your community. And so we need to divide and subdivide sovereignty and to leave at the local level absolutely everything that we possibly can, because they're the people closest to it, and they're the people who should control their own tax monies and their own sovereignty. And then we should have less and less power concentrated as you move beyond that ward republic or that farmer republic that I'm talking about.
I agree, sir, and I do think that would resonate, at least with some citizens during my time. It's a very powerful argument that you make in this letter. It's unfortunate that Mr. Adams can't be here to respond. Perhaps I can look into his further correspondence with you, but we need to take a break in just a moment. But you end this letter beautifully, sir, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to read it, that final paragraph to us.
Yes, sir. I end the letter in this way. I have thus stated my opinion on a point on which we differ, not with a view to controversy, for we are both too old to change opinions which are the result of a long life of inquiry and reflection, but on the suggestion of a former letter of yours, that we ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other. We acted in perfect harmony through a long and perilous contest for our liberty and independence. A constitution has been acquired which, though neither of us think perfect, yet both consider as competent to render our fellow citizens the happiest and the securest on whom the sun has ever shone. If we do not exactly think alike as to its imperfections, it matters little to our country, which, after voting to it long lives of disinterested labor, we have delivered over to our successors in life, who will be able to take care of it and of themselves. I am, sir, your humble servant, Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you so very much for this conversation, Mr. Jefferson.
You are most welcome, citizen.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I am out of character now, having shed my tights and wig, and I won't say I'm sitting across from David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm sitting across from him virtually. We're on other sides of the town of Bismarck, North Dakota, talking today about one of the most interesting letters that Thomas Jefferson ever wrote, this key 1813 exchange about aristocracy, in which John Adams said, look, friend, this is just the way the world works. There are always going to be people who are the most powerful, and they're going to do everything in their power to pass it on. And we may as well accept that, and we may as well find a way to manage it, because there's no system of equality that can get enough traction to survive over time. And so Jefferson is a utopian, and he believes, no, if you create conditions of more true equality of circumstance, and you educate people according to their capacity, up to their capacity, and eliminate these feudal land laws like primogeniture and entail, and maybe from time to time redistribute property very carefully and to a certain degree, you can get closer to a situation of equality than you think, and we ought to work at it, and we certainly ought to replace the pseudo aristocracy with a meritocracy.
For me, the letter, I get all of that, and I know how essential it was to Jefferson and Adams' time, the aristocracy, that issue. What really struck me was the end of this, his explanation of his idea of wards and using them to educate the people. And forgive me for being less Adams and more Jefferson this week, but think what would have happened in Virginia had that succeeded and been passed, that you would have had an educated public. That's the root of success for all of us, isn't it?
Late in life, Jefferson reflected on this and said that New England was going to get ahead of the middle colonies, and particularly Virginia, because New England had two institutions that Virginia simply refused to adopt. One of them was the New England Town Meeting, which continues to this day, where all the people of the town come into a hall and they talk about stuff and shout it out, and there are disagreements, and they debate, and different ideas are put forward, and some feelings are hurt, but it's all kept within bounds, and they hammer out something like a consensus. They certainly air their differences and grievances together. And Jefferson thought that's the petri dish, that's the nexus of democracy. When you put those citizens in that same room and everyone gets to speak his or her mind, and there is a kind of a forging of a community that comes from this sort of process. New England had it and continues to have it, and Virginia didn't. And the second institution that he saw was public education. He saw that New England had created schools in every district, and that these were schools that were not free because they were tax supported, but they were available to common citizens. And Jefferson's view was, if you can put every citizen of a township or of a county into a school system, you're going to create conditions of good government. That the best thing we can do is to educate everybody as much as possible at public expense, and that's going to create more enlightenment in the long run than anything else you can possibly do. And in fact, Jefferson so believed in public education that it almost became his sort of panacea for all human problems. Education, education, education. That's the answer. I happen to agree with both of those. And he said that because Virginia hadn't done either of those things, that it balked at public education, because the rich thought, well, why do the poor need any education at all? They were born to be poor. And the idea of the town meeting was just not within the character of the high-toned Virginians. It was Adams, I think, who said that in Virginia, every goose is a swan. That notion that that there could be a town meeting where poor people got to talk at.
See, that's what struck me, and forgive me, I'll get off this one more time. I got to go. Is that it provided a way for more individual participation in government. It's so common right now. People, I'm not going to vote. My vote doesn't count. Well, I think there's a hunger for the average citizen to become involved in government. I think of local issues in my town where there were open meetings and people would come and passionately argue their points. I think people want that sort of involvement, and we're not really set up for it. So that's what struck me about the letter, is that would have been a great model.
It was a great model. Jefferson took it from his understanding of Anglo-Saxon history. So he had this notion, which has been largely shown to be historically dicey, let's put it that way, that there were these ward republics in Northern Europe, the people who eventually crossed the Channel and settled in Great Britain, and that these 100 farmer Democrats would gather together in these ward meetings and hammer out their destiny. And so he had read this in the Germanica of Tacitus and in other books from the ancient world, and he loved it because it located democracy not in Athens or in the Roman Republic, but actually amongst the Teutonic people, the English, what would become the English-speaking people. And so he got fixated on this notion, and he really believed it. And I happen to agree, not with his historical underpinning of it, but with what you're saying, that his view, by the way, David, was that the answer to failed democracy is more of it. Empower more people, get more people involved. People rise to the occasion. You need to entrust people with the capacity for self-government and the process, the habit, the practice. And if you do, that things will improve, because people are not idiots. They have good sense. They can smell out hypocrisy. They know when they're being lied to, and you just need to empower them and things will get better. Well, that's not our system. We have 2 senators for California with a population of more than 40 million people. That's not local government. We always turn to the national government. What will we do about guns? What will we do about immigration? What will we do about fire control? What will we do about health care? And Jefferson, at least in his own time, would say, you're looking in the wrong direction. Don't look to the national government for these things. Look to the most local entity you possibly can, and that's where you will find that you can actually make progress in this area.
A little backstory for our listeners. This letter that we discussed with Mr. Jefferson this week comes from the end section of Clay's new book, Repairing Jefferson's America. And in the end of the book, Clay, you pick 13 letters that Jefferson wrote and include them in the book with with some comments. I would kind of like to get a commitment from you that we can revisit those 13 letters in future shows and discuss them with Jefferson.
I chose them, as you know, for special reason. You can get little anthologies of Jefferson's letters anywhere, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to include 13 letters that I think are fundamental to an understanding of Thomas Jefferson, that they're not necessarily the most popular or the best written or the most famous, but they're letters that help you understand how he saw the world and what world he was trying to create. And so I was going to do 12, and then I thought, I'll do 13. I'll do a baker's dozen. And so
That's great.
I'd like to go through each one because I think that each one deserves that level of attention. And by the way, my Jefferson Watch today is about that book. The book's been out since August 10th, published by Kohler Press in Norfolk, Virginia. They'll also be the publisher of my forthcoming book on the state of North Dakota. And the book was delayed until August 10th because of the pandemic, but also the publishers wanted to release it so that it could start to get some attention as the election rolls up on November 3rd, because I think we're all, I guess I speak only for myself, but I think I'm not alone in this. We're all bewildered, anxious, off our center of gravity, worried, not sure where to turn. And so this book, Repairing Jefferson's America, is intended to be a sort of a guide for the perplexed. How would a Jeffersonian vision of America play out?
For those of you who are interested, go to jeffersonhour.com. You can find out more about the book, where to get it, and about Clay's initiative to get this into the hands of state legislators everywhere. But you brought up the Jefferson Watch, and sir, I'm so pleased to say it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
I believe we are living through 4 national crises at the same time. We are in the middle of a global pandemic that has shut down whole swaths of the world. The experts are now predicting 300,000 American dead by Christmas. We are in the midst of an economic collapse, the worst since the Great Depression, with 15% unemployment and tens of millions of people reaching the desperation point in their ability to pay rent, buy gasoline, and put food on the table. The Black Lives Matter movement has put millions of Americans on the street, very few of them violent, and the majority of them not people of color. And finally, we are descending into a constitutional crisis that threatens the very survival of our democracy. The pandemic and the economic recession will eventually go away, sooner, if we handle things right. The other 2 crises are graver. There is unfinished work to be done to bring American behavior into harmony with American ideals. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Frankly, we thought we were farther along. We must not duck this moment. We must each of us do some serious reading. White rage, white fragility, how to be an anti-racist. And we must look hard and unblinkingly into the mirror, each one of us. We have to admit that we are complicit. This does not mean that we are bad people. It means that we are complicit in a system that is still rigged to protect the power and opportunity of white Americans at the expense of a truly level and race-blind playing field. There are times when I think the constitutional crisis is perhaps being exaggerated, that we will stumble and lurch our way through this as we always seem to do. Over the last few months, I have thought about little else. How seriously should we take retired Marine General John Allen's statement that Mr. Trump's acts and intentions, quote, may well signal the beginning of the end of the American experiment? Or former President Obama's statement at the Democratic National Convention that American democracy is in serious jeopardy. It is a part of wisdom not to overreact. But after reading everything I can get my hands on about the current situation, listening to the pundits, many of them lifelong conservatives that I respect, and consulting great American historians, I believe that November 3rd will be the most important day of my life. I was born in 1955. You may disagree with me. Here's what I believe is on the November 3rd ballot. Not just two old men, one nicer than the other, one more vigorous and energetic than the other. The Enlightenment is on the ballot. Checks and balances, separation of powers, the central principle of our system that no individual should ever hold too much power, that there must be guardrails to protect the people and the Constitution from runaway power. And this is not some silly charge that has no basis in fact. November 3rd is going to tell us what kind of country we want, what kind of country we are going to be. The Enlightenment is on the ballot. I urge everyone listening to do 3 things between now and the election. First, read. Read Tim Alberta's American Carnage. Read Brian Stetler's Hoax. Read Stephen Levitsky's and Daniel Zablotz's How Democracies Die. Second, have long, careful conversations with your friends and family. We need to talk these things out. This is not an election about which party will occupy the White House and the 2 houses of Congress. This is an election about what sort of country we are going to be as the 3rd decade of the 21st century unfolds. Some of these conversations will be painful. Try not to settle for the usual talking points in yourself or in your friends and family. Third, I mean this, go look in the mirror for half an hour and consult your conscience. Ask yourself what is really at stake here, how serious this crisis is, what kind of America you would like to live in, and try to ask yourself what you would think if the situation were reversed and a populist authoritarian Democrat were the incumbent and the Republicans were the party calling for checks on too much power in the hands of that individual. Don't stop looking into the mirror until you have really asked yourself who you are and what you value and what is at stake on November 3rd. I want to ask you for one more thing. If you have respect for me, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, but respect me for my attempts to contextualize the present moment in the historical context of the Founding Fathers and Jefferson and the history of the American experiment, please buy or read my book, Repairing Jefferson's America, A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship. I know this sounds like a shameless plug for my book, but the book is not about the history of pro football or about why I love North Dakota. The book is about how we can be better citizens, better read, better informed, more civil, more committed to reason and science, more committed to the idea of an American republic. The opening essays attempt to explain why we are in such a deep abyss, and that has very little to do with Donald Trump. Our problems are deeper than that. They are before the arrival of Mr. Trump on the national scene, and they will plague us long after he tweets for the last time. I'm asking you to buy my book, read it, and share it with your friends. If you like what I have to say, I ask you to write a heroic review of it on Amazon.com. My dream is for my book to go viral, to be widely enough read to have an impact, to remind our fellow Americans that we are better than our current blue state, red state polarization and congressional paralysis. As you know, my dream is to get this book into the hands of every legislator in the United States. So far, individuals like you in 6 states have come forward to make that happen. If you want to help complete the project, contact me. But meanwhile, the more appreciative reviews we get on Amazon.com, the more this book will be noticed in searches about the founders, about the current political situation, and about what is at stake in the 2020 election. I do not ask you to do this so that I can profit from my book. Of my list of 100 things that I aspire to, that doesn't even register. Climb Mount Whitney again? Right up there. Visit Greece in the next 2 years? Very close to the top. Help carry North Dakota into a new sense of its identity? That's number 1 or 2 on my list. But profit from repairing Jefferson's America? That's negligible. I do want a bigger megaphone, because I believe Jefferson has taught me what is really at stake in the American experiment, and you can help me achieve that. I've never, in 30 years, addressed you in this way. I know what I have to say will upset some of you. I'm not telling you how you should vote, though my preference this time is perhaps clear. I'm asking you to step up as the sovereign citizens of the world's most interesting experiment in government and to think hard about how you would like the future to play out. Thanks for listening. I'm Clay Jenkinson, We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.